Behind me, the walls of the ancient port city of Akko, or Acre, in the Holy Land. This was the Crusaders' first glimpse of the land they'd traveled to get here as Christian knights to wrestle the holy places away from those who held them captive. But how did they treat the chosen people of Israel who were here before them? How did the Crusaders treat them? Stay tuned to this next episode of the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when behind me, the port city of Akko. This was a stronghold for the Crusaders from the 11th to the 13th centuries. Their ships would come and go from this port. Imagine their relief arriving here after those long journeys from Europe, knowing that they were closer than ever to wresting the holy places away from those who held them captive. They had come as Christian knights with Christian zeal. But one of the problems was they had forgotten the Jewish roots of their faith. They'd forgotten that the Jews, God's chosen people, were to be here. God had given them this land. But the Crusaders were aware of replacement theology. That is, that somehow the church had replaced Israel in the plan of God. This was an erroneous teaching, but they believed it. And so when they got here, they brutalized the Jewish people along with anyone else who got in their way. The relationship between the church and Israel was broken. And that brokenness continues to this day in many quarters as Christians forget the Jewish roots of their Christian faith.
Throughout history, this beautiful ancient port city has been known by many names, among them Acre, Ptolemais, and today Akko. The Bible tells us that just over 3,000 years ago, this area of the Promised Land was given to the Israelite tribe Asher. Some 2,000 years later, after the resurrection of Jesus, the Apostle Paul visited the followers of Jesus who lived there. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Akko became a central port for travel and trade, and a very strategic gateway for those armies on a military quest to conquer the Holy Land, among them the Christian Crusaders.
Growing up in America, Christian America, I thought the Crusaders were the good guys. One of my heroes was Richard Lionheart and all the rest of it. You know, I read the books and saw the movies and all that. But when I finally studied it, when the Crusaders finally got to Jerusalem, it wasn't the one new man. They got all the Jews together and burned them in the synagogue, and they literally walked around the synagogue in Jerusalem with crosses singing, "Christ, we adore thee."
Although the Christian Bible teaches that God desires Jews and Gentiles to become so unified they are as one new man, this was the last thing on the Crusaders' minds. They had long forgotten that God had promised this land to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nor did they recall that Christianity was a gift given to the world through the Jewish people. In their minds, the church had long replaced Israel in the plans of God, and the Promised Land was theirs to claim. Christians had learned to ignore the Jewish foundations of their faith, giving in to a doctrine called replacement theology.
For the first, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 years of Christianity, there was a very painful approach to reconciling the differences between Christianity and Judaism. And that approach was to say, Judaism is finished, that Judaism is no longer relevant, that God's covenant with the Jews was replaced by the new covenant. That's why it's called the New Testament.
Christianity began as a purely Jewish movement. Jesus and his earliest followers were Jewish. Even up until the 4th century AD, Christians were reportedly attending Jewish synagogues and mingling with Jewish people. The question is, how could a movement that began within Judaism suddenly become almost entirely anti-Jewish?
It was in the Council of Nicaea, where they prohibited Christians from continuing in synagogues, which meant that Christians were still praying in synagogues in the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century. So it was a movement within Judaism. No one was denying Jesus was born a Jew and lived as a Jew. I think when the decision was made to make the real break from Judaism, in order to gain support and gain legitimacy, some of the church fathers then chose to demonize the Jews in order to delegitimize the Jews. If someone had to choose, is he going to stick with the original Judaism or with Christianity? Well, demonizing and delegitimizing Jews and Judaism would be the way to do it.
In order to demonstrate that the Jews had fallen out of favor with God, there was a kind of a circular reasoning that the Jews were banished from their homeland, lost their sovereignty, and were dispersed and oppressed because of their falling out of favor with God, and the Christian community took upon itself a leading role in proving that. And it became a circular logic. The Jews are suffering because they've fallen out of favor with God. Christians and Christianity came to replace the favored people in God's eyes, and Christians then helped to perpetuate that by subjugating the Jews.
According to replacement theology, the Jews were no longer God's prophetic connection to the earth. The early church fathers very successfully convinced their congregants that Christians were God's new chosen people. This delegitimization of Israel paved the way for horrendous crimes against the Jewish people living in Europe.
The Jews were persecuted all over Europe. The Jews, for instance, I've been in Norwich, England a couple of times and prayed with the pastors about the blood libel began in Norwich, England, that Jews who were supposed to be the people bringing the gospel and bringing the truth and the light to the Europeans, which they did until they were thrown out. The Jewish people, Jewish rabbis, the Jewish Orthodox on Passover, kill Christian children, take their blood, mix it with unleavened bread, make matzah and eat it. And so all over Europe, and it went to the Ukraine, it went to Russia, hundreds of thousands of Jews have been slaughtered at Passover time for centuries because of this lie, and it came from so-called Christians.
The persecution of Jews was not left behind in the Dark Ages. Rather, anti-Semitism thrived in the fertile soil of replacement theology and manifested itself most vividly in modern times, during the Holocaust of Nazi Germany.
This demonization of the Jew, that the Jewish theology was inferior to Christian theology, that the Jewish people were inferior to Christians, that there was a lack of legitimacy for a continuation of the Jews as people or Judaism as religion, just became, unfortunately, a recurrent theme in Christian theology and Christian practice over the years, culminating, as we know, in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, which was, although at the time Christian leaders were loath to admit it, but in more recent times, there's an understanding that the Holocaust could not have happened without 2,000 years of built-up antipathy, animosity, hatred, and discrimination against Jews in Christian tradition.
And the Holocaust wasn't just Catholics, baptized Catholics, although Hitler was a baptized Catholic. It was Lutherans too. In fact, Hitler quoted Luther, who turned anti-Semitic in his old age at the end of his, and so in those camps, for instance, one of the camps at Christmas Eve, the Jewish women were going into the gas chambers, and they were singing, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, the holiest prayer in Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, in the barracks. where these Nazi guards were, who were nominal Christians of some kind, Lutherans, and you know, it's the national religion of Germany, Catholic. Some of them wore crosses. They were singing "Silent Night." It was written in Germany. Oh, the Jews know their history. The church doesn't.
It is almost impossible to fathom that as the Jews were systematically exterminated, Christians, for the most part, did not come to their aid. Replacement theology was embedded far too deep in Christianity's history, and anti-Semitism blinded their eyes. But what is anti-Semitism, and does it still exist today?
Anti-Semitism is more than just a human prejudice. I mean, human flesh has its prejudices, and that's evident in every culture and every nation. But anti-Jewishness has an additional quality that can only be described as a spiritual quality. It is a satanic spirit, wanting to eradicate the testimony of the chosen people from the earth. Because if those chosen people can be taken out, then God's testimony is damaged. And that is Satan's plan from the very, very start. And so we have anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness arising in the strangest places, and then also in the places where you would most expect it to arise. Of course, the modern version of it was in Nazism, and now today in the Islamic world, the absolute, I would say, one-dimensional hatred of Jewish people. It really comes from the pit of hell, and it is part of a satanic strategy to destroy God's testimony on the earth.
The Bible tells us that when the first created humans sinned, the relationship between God and the human race was broken. As a result, a gap divided a holy God from a world of sin. To reconcile the world to himself, God chose one nation through whom heaven's blessings would flow, the nation of Israel. Through Israel came the commandments of God, the prophets, the Bible, and most importantly, salvation through Jesus. And while the connection between Christians and Jews was broken because of anti-Semitic erroneous theology, there is hope.
Fortunately, today, the Christian church as a whole, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, and others, have, to a great extent, with a few unfortunate exceptions, especially in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, on the whole, the Christian community in the world has rejected this ancient hatred of the Jews as being hated by God and therefore justifiably hated by the Christian community.
More than ever before in the past 2,000 years, Christians are exposing replacement theology as the evil it is and are repenting of anti-Semitism. They are rediscovering the Jewishness of Jesus and the Jewish roots of their faith. They are embracing Israel with a deep gratitude for their role in God's plan of salvation for the world. They are acknowledging with thankfulness that the Jewish people have been and remain God's prophetic connection between heaven and earth.
Because Israel forms a land bridge between three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, it always had value to the empires that wanted to conquer the whole earth. So many battles were fought in the Holy Land. They clashed here. I'm standing in the courtyard of the citadel in Akko. For nearly 200 years, this was the base for the Crusaders, the Christian knights who came from Europe. They had passion to bring the Holy Land back under Christian control and to fight those who were in control of the holy places. But the Crusaders were often brutal toward the people of Israel who lived here during that period. They had forgotten their proper roots. They had forgotten what the Jewish people had given the Christian church. This is part of what we know today as replacement theology. And it goes like this, that since the Jewish people killed Jesus, and of course that's an erroneous idea, but since that was put in the writings of the early church fathers in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Jesus walked on earth, many Christians bought into replacement theology, and they used it to brutalize the Jewish people. The Crusaders, for all their passion and their strong motivation, were guilty of that as well. And down through history, this has been used to punish the Jewish people for the death of Jesus. It should not be so, but it is a fact of history. Even during the plagues that ravished Europe, often the Jewish people were blamed for poisoning the wells. Because you see, more non-Jews were dying because of the plagues than Jews. But there was a very practical reason for that. The Jewish people were often washing their hands according to the laws of Moses. So the ritual hand washing often protected them from passing on the germs that were causing death and killed hundreds of thousands of people down through the centuries. God has promises to keep concerning the people of Israel, and they're being fulfilled even in our own generation. But we must remember that we owe much to the Jewish people. They have given us so much. Think of the 20th century and the Holocaust. This was also prompted by this erroneous thinking, this replacement theology. And 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, 1.5 million children were systematically exterminated in Europe because the Nazi propaganda said that the Jewish people were not even human beings. They were like vermin that could be exterminated. And this occurred in Christian Europe. But once again, so-called Christians forgot the Jewish roots of their faith and the fact that God had promises to keep to the Jewish people. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Rome, in Romans chapter 11, in verses 1 and 2, has this to say. He asks the question, and then he answers it for himself. In verse 1 of Romans 11, I said then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not, for I am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. You see, Christians wrongly thought that because the Jews suffered so much down through history, more than any other nation on earth, that God had given up on them. But that is not what the Bible teaches, neither in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. And the fact that the Jewish people are back in the Holy Land, and within 3 years of the end of the Second World War, Israel was a nation again, and God was keeping his promises to the Hebrew prophets that were given over 2,000 years ago. Consider the words of the prophet Isaiah, writing in the 8th century, even before Christ. Sing, O heavens, be joyful, O earth. Break out in singing, O mountains, for the Lord has comforted his people and will have mercy on his afflicted. But Zion, which is a synonym for Israel, the chosen people of God, Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me, and my Lord has forgotten me. You can't blame them for thinking that when they suffered so much, often at the hands of so-called Christians who had bought into this replacement theology idea, the idea that the church now replaced Israel in the plans of God. God says through the prophet Isaiah, can a woman forget her nursing child and not have compassion on the son of her womb? Surely they may forget, yet I will not forget you. See, I have inscribed you in the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. Your sons shall make haste, your destroyers, and those who laid you waste shall go away from you. I'm standing in a citadel built by the Crusaders. They are no longer here. It's simply a ruin where tourists come and visit the halls where the knights met, ate, and had fellowship, but at the same time plotted how they were going to injure and punish the Jewish people. That also occurred in the citadel, but the Crusaders are long gone, no longer present in the Holy Land, and the Jewish people are back, according to what the prophets have said. God says through the prophet in verse 18, lift up your eyes, look around and see, all these gather together and come to you. As I live, says the Lord, you shall surely clothe yourselves with them as an ornament and bind them on you as a bride does. For your waste and desolate places and the land of your destruction will even now be too small for the inhabitants, and those who swallowed you up will be far away. And then this wonderful promise in verse 20, The children you will have after you have lost the others will again say in your ears, this place is too small for me. Give me a place where I may dwell. The land of Israel is a tiny strip on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1948, when Israel was reestablished as a nation, there were some 600,000 Jewish people living here. Now, in the 21st century, there are more than 6 million. They have come from the four winds. They have been brought back, exactly as the prophet said, regathered after nearly 2 millennia, 2,000 years of being scattered, exiled among the Gentile nations. But now they're back, exactly as the prophets said they would in the land. This little place is becoming too small for them, exactly as Isaiah prophesied. But there's more. God says in verse 22, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will lift up my hand in an oath to the nations and set up my standard for the peoples. They shall bring your sons, Jewish sons, in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders. So God is saying a new day will dawn over the land of Israel. And the Christian persecution that had occurred down through the centuries will come to an end, and Christians will begin to bless the people of Israel. They will carry your sons in their arms and your daughters on their shoulder. You know, this is literally being fulfilled today, because many Christians all over the world of many nationalities are standing up and speaking out in behalf of the Jewish people, according to what the prophets and the Christian apostles have said, that we ought to be blessing the Jewish people who have blessed us with. This Bible is the product of the Hebrew prophets, the Christian apostles, many of whom were Jews. They've given us these holy scriptures, God's roadmap, standards for living, if you like. They have given us so much. They gave us Jesus of Nazareth, who is a Jew. And now it is time for us to give back to Israel. They're suffering almost at an end, and they look forward to the coming of their Messiah. And God, through Isaiah, says Gentiles can have a role in this wonderful regathering. They can bring your sons in their arms and their daughters on their shoulders. It's time to bless the people of Israel, because God said, those who bless Israel will themselves be blessed. With so much brokenness between the church and the people of Israel down through the centuries, the question must be asked today, can this broken relationship ever be restored? I believe the Apostle Paul gives his insights in his own struggles about the Jewish people and their relationship to the Christian church. In Romans chapter 11, Paul begins by asking the question, has God given up on Israel? And he answers with a resounding no. God has promises to keep concerning Israel. But then in Romans 15, Paul speaks to the church, and he says, remember what Israel has given us in so many words. They have given us spiritual blessings. They gave us the prophets. They gave us the New Testament and the writings of Paul, who was a Jew that believed in Jesus. They have given us so much spiritually. They gave us Jesus of Nazareth, who was a Jew. And we ought to return to Israel material blessings.